tell us how you learned about Kenn and his diagnosis.
So I actually heard of Kenn before he ever got here. And his liver physician down in Charlotte had called me actually and said, hey, I've got this patient, and gave me some background on the story of, the fact that he had a transplant, and that transplant had done well in the beginning, but that it was really the new organ he'd gotten was struggling. And there was a lot of evidence that the organ itself was failing. And he had sort of said, well, this is the story. We think things are quite complicated. What was happening to Kenn's liver was not the norm after a liver transplant at all. And I think the team down in Charlotte had felt that the complexity of Kenn's situation, both from how his liver was doing, the immune attack that was eating up the new liver he'd received, and then also some of the impact that his progressive liver disease was having on his general health, made him a more complicated patient than perhaps they felt very comfortable taking care of. And Dr. Hansen, who I've known for a long, long time, we obviously work at different places, but really in the liver transplant community, we're all one giant family. We either all train together or have known each other for years, and we try and help each other out when we can. And so John had called looking for some advice and maybe a helping hand from the team here at Duke, since we are able to take care sometimes of patients that are more complicated than centers like the one where Kenn was originally transplanted, in Charlotte, and that Dr. Hansen was managing. So I heard about him first on the telephone. And I said, well, this sounds like a compelling story. I mean, he was obviously still very young. He's young today, even particularly compared to me. And I thought, wow, we need to do whatever we can to see whether we might be able to help this young gentleman who, through no fault of his own, was once again in dire straits. And so after I talked to Dr. Hansen at that time, and I still remember the conversation today, even these 5 years later, I thought, well, let's get the guy up here and take a look at him and see whether he has a disease that we might impact with medicines now to prevent a transplant, or whether he's even in any physical shape to undergo a second transplant, which is always more complicated than the first.
Yeah, that was the other question I was going to say. Getting him transferred from Atrium Health to you all, that would have been a feat in itself, right? Just both physically moving there almost and being right there at Duke, right?
Yeah, and it's a sort of thing where it's sort of a psychological feat to have it happen. Fortunately, when we have patients that are in need, that are really in a tough situation, we can make the wheels move pretty quickly. But you're right, we have to get all the information about Kenn's initial transplant and all the events that had happened in the intervening years, because between the time he had his first transplant and the time he met us, nearly 8 or 9 years had gone by. And a lot of things had happened over those years, and understanding what those things were was going to be key to us understanding what we might be able to do different, how we might be able to manage things differently if we did a second transplant. So I think it was more a psychological feat to develop, one that we're not too unused to managing. A lot of sick liver patients need to come to transplant centers pretty quickly. So we're used to working with pace to get patients here, but it did require good collaboration between the guys at Atrium and his team down there and us, so that by the time he got here for his first visit, we had a really good understanding of what had happened, so then we could then begin moving forward to try and get him on the path to getting a second liver transplant.
So knowing that he had already had one transplant, we're at this position now where it's not only a need for just one organ, but also multi-organs. How did that play out in his getting to Duke and what you all are having to do, and the specific donor, I guess, antibodies, and especially like you said, with Kenn being obese, okay, at that time.
Yeah.
And his age, like you said, he's still a young man, but relatively young at that time. How did all of that play into it? Because now we're not just looking for one, one part of his body, we're looking at two.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's no doubt that whenever we have to think about doing a second liver transplant, which thankfully is the exception rather than the rule, most of the livers that we put in find their new home, a good environment, and don't run into troubles like Ken. So what happened to his liver is definitely an uncommon event. And I want to make everyone aware of that, because I don't want people to think that, oh, if you get a liver transplant, you're going to need another one a few years later. That's not what normally happens. But what happened to Ken is his immune system and the liver he'd gotten, the first liver he received as a transplant, were those two things were not friendly to each other. And we still don't understand what makes that happen. But when we look at that, we say, okay, well, we're thinking about a second liver transplant. There's a few things that might help us. So the second liver that goes in is going to come from a donor that probably genetically bears little resemblance to the first liver that went in. And that first liver and Ken's immune system were not nice to each other. They had a immune battle going on that was eating up his first liver that he had received. And so statistically, it would be likely that the second liver we would put in wouldn't have the exact same or even a similar makeup to that first liver. So that was going to be in our favor, and allowed us to think, okay, we might be able to get away with this. In addition, as we looked at the medicines that he had gotten after his first transplant, we learned a lot in hindsight about what he could and couldn't tolerate from an anti-rejection perspective. And that allowed us to lay the groundwork for what we thought could be a successful plan if we put a second liver in there. Now, the operation when we do a second transplant is always worse than the first one. It's, there's scar tissue in there from the first transplant. So the surgery itself is going to be much more difficult. And we have to keep that in mind as we think about what kind of a patient can get through the rigors of a difficult redo, a second liver transplant. Again, Ken's age was in his favor. And the fact that we knew he had a strong heart and lungs was in his favor. But as you alluded to, his kidneys were not that good. And when we first met him, we actually were thinking that we would try and get him listed on the waiting list for what we would call a simultaneous liver and kidney transplant, where from the same donor, the liver and the kidney would come as a pair. And in some ways, they would actually look out for each other, I say. The liver from that donor actually helps protect the kidneys. But it turns out that Ken happened to arrive on our doorstep at a time just exactly when the national policy about who's allowed to have a liver and a kidney at exactly the same time had changed. So between the time I saw him for his first visit and the time we were getting ready to list him, the national rule book on liver and kidney transplant had morphed. And there were good reasons for that. It was a rational thing that is actually going to help the whole country as a whole. And it turned out that for Ken, it didn't help him very much. Now, part of that was, though, that since we weren't allowed to give him a liver and kidney at the same time by national allocation policy, what did happen with the new rules as they came into play was it said, okay, well, we're not going to let everyone get a kidney that the teams think would benefit from one. But it turns out that if you have persistent kidney failure after that liver transplant, and that doesn't improve when a new liver goes in there, because sometimes the kidneys will actually get better when a liver transplant occurs. But in Ken's case, they did not. Then the patients will have really a huge amount of priority to get a kidney. And so that's what took place in Ken's circumstances. We weren't permitted to give him a kidney at the same time as he got his liver transplant, but within a few months, he had met the criteria that allowed him to be way up on the kidney transplant list. So fortunately, he didn't have to wait very long in order to get his kidney transplant. And of course, here we are now, some 4 years later or so, and both his liver and his kidney are working wonderfully. So it was a rocky road in a patient who came to us very ill. And I remember what Ken looked like when I met him. I'll never forget that first day. He had incredible spirit. That was awesome. That was going to help us. But the body was weak. in terms of how much swelling he had and how much his liver disease had impacted his strength and so forth. And I think, honestly, if he had come to us as a 60-year-old, we might not have thought we could get him through the recovery period. But because he was in his 30s and had done so well after his first transplant, we had more optimism that despite how ill he was, that we might be able to pull him through the operations. And, obviously, time has proven us right in that, his liver has worked really well. And then, although his kidneys didn't recover from his liver transplant that we did here at Duke, we had him in a good place because the national allocation system gave him lots of extra priority because we had not given him a kidney in the first place. And then therefore we were able to quickly get him that kidney later on.
So you mentioned that allocation system. So there is a time that has to be thought about before we go into another transplant. I'm glad you cleared that up because I've heard questions about whether or not you can do both.
You can do both. It is possible, and even the allocation system permits us to do both. But the medical guidelines that guide our thinking about that sort of tell us, oh, this would be a good candidate to get both, and we're going to allow you to take both organs from the same donor and use them in a particular patient, are quite black and white in terms of strict. Either you have these numbers on your kidney tests or you don't. And Kenn didn't quite have those numbers in terms of how bad his kidney disease was at the time he was ready for a liver. And frankly, his liver disease was doing so poorly at that point in time that we didn't think we could wait longer and see, oh, well, maybe if his kidneys get a little worse, he'll qualify for the new allocation system. But we didn't think we had time for that, we needed to get since the liver was the dominant thing that was really hurting him badly day to day, we needed to get a new liver in there in order to keep him going. So then later on, he'd be able to have that kidney transplant if we needed it.
When he got to Duke, you sat down with him, his family. What is that like when you're sitting down with the family and you're going through what this procedure is going to look like, what it's going to be like? What's that conversation with the family?
Well, so as we look at people that are coming to see us for transplant evaluation, it's really not a single conversation. It turns out that it's probably about 10 conversations, because as you're alluding to, telling the family about this and explaining how the process works and understanding how the evaluation unfolds that gives us confidence that someone's going to be able to get through the operation. And then what is it like on the other side of the transplant? What's the recovery like? What can they expect? That's a lot of information. And so in reality, when patients come to see us for a transplant assessment, they really are having truly about 10 of those conversations, one with the medical doctor, one with the surgeons, one with the social workers, one with the transplant nurse coordinators who serve in an educational role. They may be meeting with psychologists and cardiologists and kidney doctors. And each of them, each of the people that they're meeting with provides probably a different insight and a different angle, so that it really is a series of conversations. Now, in Kenn's circumstances, a little bit of it was easier than average because he'd already had a liver transplant. So in that regard, when I got to meet him, he already knew what the surgery was all about. He already knew what the hospitalization was likely to be like because he had experienced that personally. Most of our patients, of course, are not coming for a second transplant. We're meeting them for the first time. And so those conversations are much more detailed, and the patients and their family don't really have as much insight into what the experience is going to be like. And although we try and do our darndest to really explain the whole circumstances to the patient and their family, I'll bet you if you ask the patients when it's all done, was that exactly what the doctors had told you to expect? We can't really even explain that in a way that's real, right? The idea that you're going to have this big operation that's going to include your entire abdomen, and that you're going to be in the ICU, and that your recovery is going to look like this. But no matter how sick you are now, you're going to probably walk out of the hospital, and the great majority of our patients get to go to home. They don't have to go to a rehab center and so forth. It's I suspect that what we tell them can never quite sink home. And a lot of times the patients come to us and they're scared to death, understandably, because frankly, they are dying. They are dying from their liver disease. They feel terrible. Their life has already been disrupted in a dramatic way for the great majority of our patients that we meet. And now they're trying to figure out, is there a lifeline out there? Is there something that's going to happen that can stop this terrible decline in my health and get me back on my feet? And that's, we try and share that optimism with them and explain to them that if a person is actually a candidate, we think that their body will be able to withstand the transplant, and they've got the right kind of resilience that sort of gumption to get through all the struggles and hurdles that will be ahead, that our goal is to get them back living a full and rich life again, which is of course what we've seen in Kenn's case. To see him now, I just smile every time I see him on my clinic schedule, because I know what he looks like now and what a wonderful life he has now in terms of, his wife and his job and his participation in the community. And I think, wow, if we hadn't done this, none of that would have happened. He would have died a long time ago.
A long time ago. Yes, you're right. I remember going to the hospital to see him at his previous weight. But when I walked into the hospital room, it looked like everything was swollen from face all the way down to legs and everything. But I had to go in with that sense of humor. You're doing fine. You look great, but it was a little frightening at first.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when he got to Duke, we were touching base from time to time just to see how that was going to happen. I remember when he was released and he was able to come back to Charlotte and then go back again. And I was like, are you ready for this? I got this, and he stayed in great spirits, which I want to talk about now, about his post-transplant success, okay? And his involvement in being a spokesperson for that Duke University transplant. When you all did the little story on him, I was sitting here like, oh God, yes, this is Kenn, this is great. So to talk to us a little bit about his post-transplant success.
Yeah. So as we've discussed, his transplant went as absolutely well as we could have hoped, and some of the things that we feared in terms of his immune system reacting negatively to his new liver didn't happen, and that's wonderful. I think that's a combination of the new liver had a lot of differences from the first liver he got, not ones we can measure necessarily, but did have a lot of differences that worked to his benefit. And as I mentioned, we learned a lot from what medicines he had taken the first time, and we knew better what medicines, in hindsight, what medicines were probably going to work better in his system. And I do want to emphasize one other thing. This is true for all of our transplant patients, and I think true probably for all of us as we face challenges in life, whether they're medical challenges or otherwise. One of the other things that really helped Kenn specifically, and helps a lot of our patients, is when they come to us with an attitude, this thing we call resilience, that we can't really measure. We think we know what it looks like, but we don't really necessarily know. But when people say, oh yeah, I'm terrible, but I'm going to keep going. I know I look terrible. I know I can barely get up out of this chair, but I want to keep going. I'm strong. I can do this. That helps a ton, because the going is going to get tougher before it gets better. And Kenn absolutely demonstrated that resilience, that get up and go, that certainty that he was going to make it through whatever hurdles we threw in front of him. And I think that is a common trait that helps our patients. And some of it is, endogenous. It comes from the patient. Some of it comes from their family and their encouragement, their community that is telling them, you can do this. We're with you. We've got your back. We'll help you through this time of difficulty. I think that makes a big difference. But then, after Kenn gets his transplant and, comes back and gets his kidney transplant, under the new system, the new rules of allocation, and is able to come off of dialysis and begins his real total recovery, medically speaking. That same kindness, that same spirit that, was part of his persona, even in the worst of times medically for him, began to shine through much more. And that, his story of his recovery was, I thought such an incredible example that I wanted to share that with other patients out there, because most patients are just living the experience of themselves. They're never going to meet another liver transplant patient unless they happen to meet them in our clinic, or coming to see us when, there's lots of transplant patients coming for clinic sessions and so forth. But outside of that, they're never really going to know anybody else that ever had a transplant. And they can really be, I think, scared to the point where they're maybe even afraid to do the transplant, not maybe because they couldn't get through it, but they just don't know. They look at themselves in the mirror and think, I'm never going to get there. I'm never going to get through this. And I thought Kenn's story of how sick he was and how we were able, in fact, to get him through this was a way of sharing with patients out there who might come, for example, to our website and say, oh, I want to learn more about liver transplant. I don't care whether it's at Duke or anywhere else. I want to learn more about liver transplant. That his story was one of hope and success and optimism. And that by that example, they might also feel like, oh, wow, look at this guy. He made it through what must have been an incredibly difficult time. And look what he's doing now. He is back to that rich and full life once again. And so being able to share that story with others, I hope continues to give our patients or patients out there, facing the possibility of transplant, optimism that they too can get through this. And then, of course, Kenn has become a great spokesman for the transplant, process. He is a great person to talk with under any circumstances. But I know that he shares his story, and I think that does two things. It again gives hope to other patients that are in the same circumstances that he was in. But I'm hopeful that his story also makes people think about what it means to be an organ donor. Because I think a lot of people never really think about that in advance, and that they don't quite know how it works, and they're not really sure what the outcome is. And there's all these crazy movies about stuff that's just simply not true. They're exciting movies. They're exciting movies out there, but they're not how the transplant system actually works. And there are all these urban legends about things that people might think actually happen, but never do. The system's actually very well organized.
Okay.
But, there are lots of people that I talk to that have never thought about being an organ donor. Yet the miracles that happen, like Kenn's miracle times 3, depends on the fact that 3 people out there had expressed their interest in being an organ donor. His first liver, his second liver, and then of course his kidney. And so I think the other thing that's wonderful about people and patients like Kenn is that they're willing to share the story. And I'm hopeful that that motivates others that have a personal connection to someone who did have 3 miracles happen, to think, wow, I never knew it would be like that. That's what can really be the outcome of this incredible gift, the gift of life. And so I think one of the other great things about spokespeople like Kenn is that may motivate folks to look inward and say, I never really knew about that. Maybe I should ask a few questions about what this is all about. Maybe I need to go and sign up on one of the donor registries. Because these things that happen with transplant, to a large majority, only happen because someone else thought about it in advance.
Which brings me to this question, and we'll be done here shortly, because you were talking about organ donations. So why is it important for people to become interested, number one, in organ donations? But specifically people in BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, because you are right. Some are afraid to do this because they're thinking that, like you said, movies and everything has linked that not only do people steal organs. I saw a movie like a couple of weeks ago, they were stealing organs. No, I was watching an episode of my favorite show, Law and Order, and there was this guy who was selling organs. You get all that in your head, but how do I become a donor? And what do I need to consider as an African American female to help someone else? But the other thing is, now I'll be done with this question, is like, for myself, I'm diabetic. So can I still, or should I not or what do I?
Yeah, so let's take the organ donation question in a couple different slices.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things you had said is, why is it important for people to think about it?
Mhm.
Well, I say this to patients all the time. You know, every organ transplant we do from a deceased donor is a combination of a tragedy that happened to the donor, and I think a miracle that happened to the recipient.
Mm-hmm.
But let's think about what some of those tragedies look like at a family level, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody had an unexpected automobile accident, a trauma that led the donor to become brain dead. There was an unexpected stroke that occurred. That's a common thing that leads to brain death and organ donation. And imagine, as the family, you've never talked about organ donation at all, and you're grieving over the fact that your husband, your brother, your daughter, your sister has had a terrible medical thing happen, and they're going to die. They're going to pass away. And you're caught up in the grief of that moment, understandably. Like, I totally get that. And someone from the organ donation system comes to you and says, oh, you know, it turns out that your loved one would potentially be an organ donor. What do you think they would want to do? Well, if you've never ever talked about it before as a family, that's a difficult question to answer sometimes. You're not sure what they would have wanted to do. So that's why I think it's critical that we all talk to each other about it in our family and in our communities, to A, learn more about it, but B, express our interests. So I'm an organ donor. My wife and my kids absolutely know that. I want to donate everything possible because I know about these miracles that happen. If I'm not going to be here anymore on this earth in my body, then someone else can use all of the things that might help somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I think talking about it with our families in advance is important, because then even if you hadn't signed up to be an organ donor in one of the registries, if your next of kin was there when that tragedy happened to you, they would know. They'd say, oh, I know that Carl had actually wanted to be an organ donor. He was inspired by Ken Wiggins or anybody else. He wanted to be an organ donor. And then, since I'm dead in that circumstance, I'm brain dead in that circumstance, my next of kin can say, hey, Carl wants to be an organ donor, let's proceed. So that's why talking about it first is very important. And there's the learning part as well. But then, as you alluded to, it's also important in communities where there has been some acknowledged and appropriate mistrust of the healthcare system, whether it's from historical reasons or whether it's from these, you know, as you said in an example, these television shows that we watch or movies that make you think the system is way different than it really is. It's important to know that under no circumstances will somebody who's going to be an organ donor have life-saving therapies withdrawn in organ to procure their organs. That's a myth. That is not how the system works in this country in any shape or form. What happens is, if a terrible thing has happened and you're brain dead, meaning there is no neurologic function up here and you're only being kept alive by life support, that's when you qualify to be a brain dead organ donor. So no one's going to pull the plug early in order to get your organs, which is a common myth. A lot of people hear about that. And there are really strict rules all over the country in every single state to prevent that from happening. So that's an important thing for everybody to understand. And then if someone was, and in communities of color in particular, I think some of those stories and history weighs heavier on some of those communities. And I absolutely understand why that is historically. And it's our job as medical professionals to help spread the word about what goes on in 2021 and reassure people that being an organ donor is in fact a safe thing to do from a medical perspective. It's not going to lead to your premature death in that circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, it turns out that when we look at some communities, and this is true in the African-American community and in other communities of color and indigenous communities as well, there is lots of need for organ transplantation, but those communities are underrepresented on the donor registries. Now, it doesn't work that, I'm going to get a liver from someone that looks like me or somebody that's from my community. That's not how the system works. But if we look at it as a sort of a communal idea, how do we take care of each other? If we recognize people in our community that have needed transplants and have benefited from transplants and are living those rich lives as a result of our transplant, as a community, I think it's important we say, wow, how did that happen? And how can we too contribute to those miracles that have occurred? And that's why I think getting the word out, and actually here at Duke right now, that is a huge push in our transplant program to identify ways to actually help get out and educate communities that might benefit from that education so that people can make well-informed decisions. Everybody gets to make their own decision. If you don't want to be an organ donor, you don't have to be. Although there are some countries where that's not true, but not in the United States. In the United States, you have to opt in. Either you need to tell your family that you're opting in, or you need to sign up for one of the donor registries. Now, if somebody's motivated to become an organ donor and they're not one right now, there are ways where you can do that online, and you can do it from the comfort of your own home and in the privacy of your own home as well. Most of us kind of know about, getting asked about it when we go renew our driver's license. Well, I can think of no worse place to sign up to be an organ donor than when I've been standing in line for 2.5 hours at the Durham DMV. It's hotter than heck in there, and there's about 150 people all jammed in there, and the guy says, hey, do you want to be an organ donor? No. I said yes, right? Because my whole career is about organ transplantation, so I better believe.
Right.
But that's probably not the best place to be to become an organ donor. But it's better than nothing, but it's probably not the best place. But nowadays, in the era of the internet, you can actually go on to any of the websites that are run by Donate Life. That's the National Organ Donation System overall. Find Donate Life North Carolina online, and you can sign up to be an organ donor in that registry. And that registry is now nationwide. If something were to happen to you where, in fact, you did, in fact, have a tragedy that occurred to your health, no matter where that happened, no matter what state you happen to be in, if and when that happened, they would be able to identify that, yes, in fact, you had signed up and expressed your interest. You can do it on Facebook. There's a place on Facebook to say, hey, I'm an organ donor. And you can sign up through Facebook, which of course, so many people use nowadays. So there are lots of different ways to get into the system now. And it's not, you don't have to go stand in line at the DMV because, again, nobody wants to do that.
That's very good. Yeah, that DMV line is something else. Thank you so much for your time on today. I know your schedule's really busy. We appreciate you. Have a great day, sir.
You too now. Take care.
Bye-bye.